All right. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. This event is part of this year's Summer Academy for Pluralist Economics, and my name is Sonia. I'm part of the organizing team, and I will be moderating this event. Before getting into the content, I want to share two administrative notes. So first, please be aware that this lecture is being recorded. Be visible because it's a webinar. And second, we have disabled the chat, but there will be a lot of time for Q&A at the end of the lecture. So please ask your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And there are two options to ask a question. So you could either ask them anonymously, in which case we will simply read your questions to the lecturer, or you can ask the question using your name. And in that case, we will give you the chance to unmute yourself and ask the question directly. But please be aware that in that case, your voice will be recorded and also, then later in the recording. And one more point about the Q&A, it would be great if you could like the questions that you find relevant so that we can prioritize the questions in case we get a lot of them, which we are of course hoping for. That being said, let's move on to the exciting part. So tonight's lecture will introduce you to the concept of Doughnut Economics, which was initially developed by Kate Raworth in 2012. And the idea of the donut aims to challenge the current economic paradigm and offers novel ways to conceptualize and address the climate crisis from an economic perspective. And within this context of climate policy, we will also discuss the relationship between economic theory and practice. So I'm enormously grateful to welcome tonight's speaker, Leonardo Conte, who currently lectures about Doughnut Economics at the Franklin University in Switzerland and is also a member of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. Since I'm sure that his ability to introduce himself will definitely exceed my own, I would like to just hand over the virtual mic to our speaker for further introductions and explanations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia. I hope you all can hear me well. Welcome, everyone. Thanks again for the kind invitation and introduction. I will start sharing my screen so that you can tell me whether everything works out. Cool. See people nodding, so that means you hear me well and you see everything. So welcome again. Yeah, Sonia already gave you all the administrative instructions. I'm really happy to be here. It's the first time for me, both as a participant to the Summer Academy and lecturer. So my role tonight is to talk you about Doughnut Economics. I will rather have a broad and interdisciplinary overview of the topic. This will be clear to you soon why I'm doing so. Not only because I think Kate did a great job in explaining every pillar of it through the book that I will mention later throughout the lecture, but especially because my take will be informed by other let's say subtopics, which will be first the role, as Sonia already anticipated, of theory, economic theory in general, into practice. And secondly, the relationship specifically between economics and climate change. So I will briefly tell something about my background. So I have a background in economics. I did some studies in more applied disciplines like development studies, international cooperations. I did some research as well in policy and institutional research in general, but especially I'm here first as member and co-founder of the Swiss branch of Rethink Economics, and secondly as professor and adjunct professor and lecturer at Franklin University Institute, where I actually teach to some extent Doughnut Economics with similar perspectives to which I'm drawing tonight. I'm also a PhD candidate at another Swiss university. There I'm rather doing more applied stuff on consumer behavior and interdisciplinary market studies. And yeah, again, I'm really attached to the network of Rethinking Economics and Exploring Economics as well from now on, I guess. But we've been doing some stuff both at the local level and in the last 2 years, I was also managing the partnerships for the international network. So hope I was brief enough. Let's get into the outline of tonight. So my 3 main points will be first what I call what has been called, and what I will explain you during the main first part, what is called the performativity of economics and the performative power of the discipline of economic theory in general. So into practice. Especially the relationship between economic theory and climate change, how economics has generally, let's say, tackled climate change, especially environmental economics. Just a brief introduction and a couple of concepts from there that will in turn draw me into the final part, which will be indeed Doughnut Economics, so ecological economics more broadly, the difference with environmental economics, and the main points in which these discipline, so this theory, let's say, and this approach to economy and climate change differs from standard mainstream, you can call it, economics. So first, probably this is the part most of you are less familiar with. So my interdisciplinary studies allowed me to do some research on economic sociology. So when I mention consumer behavior and marketing, actually there's a branch of qualitative applied market studies, among which there is this notion coming from mainly from sociologists to some extent criticizing the economic approach, the standard economic approach, which is called the theory of performativity. So what this is and what does that mean exactly? So as an intro to that, I wanted to introduce the concept of situated knowledge. So my main, let's say, starting point is that every social science, especially every economic theory in this case, starts off an intent and a willingness to study a phenomenon which is embedded into a historical context, right? So that's a first top left you see in this cycle. And this historical context presumably has some main hot topics, themes, issues, problems to solve, etc. You can think about climate change now, COVID, etc., or inequality. I mean, also other kind of social issues that are generally studied and tackled with certain techniques and methods that are often developed on purpose for the issue that the social science want to, in this case, economics wants to tackle. So techniques and methods that are developed on top of tackling specific issues of the time. The thing is, and the main point here, is that this knowledge, in this particular sense, these techniques and these methods entail a particular mindset. Here it's forma mentis in Latin, but the main thing here is that this mindset starts off these these techniques and methods. So it's a cycle that goes from developing these techniques, using them, applying them, which in turn entail a specific mindset. This is the mindset at the basis of the theory that is developed throughout the application of this knowledge, of these methods in this case. You can turn around the cycle, methods, and theory, and you can swap them, but the main concept here is that those mindsets are situated in a specific historical context. This is the main point that introduces the concept of performativity. There are two ways in which economics is and can be viewed as a situated knowledge in time and space. One is the role of economics education. So let's say it's the performativity in the sense of Keynes or Keynes in British proper accent, proper pronunciation. And this quote, which is quite famous to you probably and quite known already, actually gives you the idea of this concept. So economics performing reality through, so shaping reality through practitioners, through practitioners, meaning through education, economics education, both of, you can think about policymakers, so actual economists. You can also think about business practitioners, business professionals, consultants, managers, marketers, whoever either studied economics or had some background in economics before his or her profession, or practicing applied economics disciplines like management, marketing, and similar. The cycle is similar to the one I showed you before when I introduced the concept of situated knowledge, with the particular characteristic that here there are long cycles and long cycle of impacts, because of course those practical men and today's business practitioners are indeed applying theories that they have been studied probably a generation ago. So keep in mind also this kind of delayed impact. There has been research, for instance, showing how economic students are generally less generous, more greedy, etc. This research has been debated as well, whether it's actually indoctrination or selection effects. But most agree that within the social sciences, studying economics has a peculiar effect, let's say, on practice. So this is the first way in which you could argue economics as economic theory has an effect on practice, both in policy and business. The second point, the second way in which actually this happens is finally with what has been called performativity. So economics can shape reality both through education and other kind of ways that are studied by performativity scholars. So mainly economic sociologists like Michel Calon or Donald Mackenzie, which is the main author of the book that you see on the right. There's a lot of research after the end of the last century. So mainly in the 2000 and 2010. So let's say since the end of the 90s, on the performative role of economics. And the starting point is, as any social science, and any social scientist, economics, and economists, of course, claim to describe economic reality in this case. So to describe markets, for instance, or economic behavior of agents of any kind. But it's known that there are disciplines like law, if you think about law studies, applied law studies, that can also shape social reality by prescribing, in this case, for the case of law studies, by normatively prescribing reality. So think about the same kind of a similar relationship between theory and practice when you think about the performative role of economics. This is the main definition that has been used. So it's the power to, rather than, and not only providing descriptions, but focusing on the power of those descriptions to inform practices, institutions, instruments that are actually applied in the economic reality and therefore shape the economic reality itself. This can be through a lot of means. So you can have, there's research showing how this was true for markets itself. So market design, for instance. There is both research on actual, like from the strawberry market to the financial markets. So how options design actually shape, so perform reality. So a formula or a theory that has been developed by trying to describe how the financial options work, at the end, by being used by those practitioners, actually shape and actually turns into reality what was just a description, let's say. So there's an example, which is the main example in finance, which is informed by theory by Donald Mackenzie, by the way that studied how the Black-Merton-Scholes formula was developed, by as any theory, let's say, in social science, to describe, as an attempt to describe financial markets, and at the end, through the use of this formula by actual financial actors, this was actually put in practice and therefore shaped the actual way in which those actions worked more and more. So that's the main idea. This is also true for economic actors. There are studies in that shows how Homo economicus has been. So the main assumption of neoclassical economics has been, as an assumption, embedded into theory that has been put in practice, applied in practice, and therefore in turn shaped actual economic behavior in that direction. So by making, let's say, making people more rational, something like that. Organizational practices, management practices, advertising, even there's many areas in which this role of economic theory in shaping economic reality has been shown. The main mean through which this happens is the discourse around economic reality. So the discourse gathered through and carried by that economic theory, when applied to practice, then shapes economic reality in this way. So the role of economic discourse here is key in shaping the economy itself through the use of applied economic theory. There's some references here to all of this research I've been mentioning, so you feel free to go check it out. It's very interesting and it's very let's say contemporary. Yes, so that's the main point that I wanted to make before entering the core of today's lecture. So keep in mind the performative role of economics and how this can impact economic policy. So how economic theory can actually impact economic policy. Then you can think about many areas in which this happens. Of course, today we're talking about Doughnut and ecological economics, so I will mainly focus on the issue of climate change, but not only, because of course Doughnut economics is much more broad than that. But I want to show you here in this second section how climate change was mainly tackled and considered and approached by neoclassical economists or by mainstream economics so far. Eventually the pitfalls of this approach and how this actually can have an impact, good or bad, in practice. So which is the direction of the performativity of environmental economics, for instance. So one main theory that, again, as any other theory in economics, was developed with the attempt to describe reality, is something that you may be already familiar with, which is called the environmental Kuznets curve. Probably most of you are familiar with the Kuznets curve, which is a relation, which is basically a statistical relationship, empirically studied in inequality. So it's the relationship between inequality and GDP per capita. Here you have, let's say, the environmental version of this. So instead of the inequality variable, dependent variable, on the left, you have a proxy for environmental degradation. This is just to say that this curve was gathered pretty similarly to the original Kuznets curve, which was developed by Simon Kuznets in the 50s. This is much more recent and, of course, applied to to another topic, which is environmental degradation, and studies the relationship between the environment and economic growth. So what this curve just says, mainly especially as an economic policy consequence, is that when you want to tackle pollution, especially, we're talking here about environmental degradation in general, but you can think about greenhouse gases and another proxy for environmental degradations. It has to get worse in terms of environmental degradation before it can get better. So in other words, this statistical relationship showed at that time that empirically there is a certain relationship between GDP per capita and environmental degradation. I can put you the graph again. And after a certain point of GDP per capita, so after a certain level of economic growth in terms of GDP per capita, environmental degradation will be able to be decreased. So this is the main idea here. To the extent that implications can go as far as saying, let's wait for that turning point, and things will get better in terms of environmental degradation for a number of reasons before, so that we can, kind of naturally tackling climate change. The idea is very similar to the Kuznets curve. So in that theory, in that curve, the idea was if we go after a certain point of GDP growth, inequality will naturally decrease. Here it's the same with environmental degradation in place. And of course, this was to some extent used as a justification for, let's call it, trickle-down economics in climate policy. And as unfortunately many times happen in economics, this model, let's call it, or this theory was as simple as wrong to some extent. And exactly as for the original coordinate curve, the data that were gathered not only were just panel data, so we're just like picturing hotspot in the distribution of the world countries, so it was not a time series, but especially those data were fundamentally incomplete. A lot of variables were not included, and as for the original coordinates curve, there were problems in basic problems in empirical evaluation and statistical techniques that were used to develop this model. There were many other issues that have been pointed at this curve, to the extent that now has been kind of debunked. But for many years, this was one of the standards informing climate policy. So this shows you let's say the power of economic theory in shaping, in this case, climate policy. Path dependency was another issue. There are many counterfactuals and further research that kind of contradicted the main point of this theory. So, for example, the fact that greenhouse gases emissions are still rising in developed country kind of contradict the main policy implications of the environmental consent curve, and many other points, many other factors that go against, let's say, and proved wrong these findings. One of them being that wealthy nations export the main polluting activities to the poor countries. So all these kind of historical and structural factors that cannot be often embedded in these kind of mathematical models. So this was the first point that I wanted to make on the relationship between economic theory, and especially environmental economics theory, and climate policy. The second point is that most of environmental economics, and this is still true today, of course, comes from the mainstream approach of neoclassical economists, who still consider climate change and many factors regarding climate change or proxies for climate change. So, for example, emissions or water or air pollution, mostly as negative externalities of the economic activity. So I'm not going into the details of what a negative externality is in the main supply and demand model, but it's mainly the cost of the economic transactions in place. So you can think about the supply chain or factories producing whatever. Let's say in this case, the pollution or the chemicals, if you think about the chemicals spilling over rivers nearby, or stuff like this, you can consider these as costs of the economic transaction itself. So this is the main consideration and the main concept, the one of negative externality, that has been used to study processes like this one. And climate change is one of the main negative externality, if you consider it this way. So in a framework of supply and demand, in a mainstream economic framework where there are market failures, as they call it, climate change and those spillover of standard economic transactions are considered negative if they are costs, negative externalities of the economic transaction itself. The problem is that those negative externalities are dumped on third parties. So those third parties are not the economic transactions actors themselves, but usually are others. And in others, you can include society as a whole, or specific local communities like the territory where the economic transactions happens, or where the business operates, etc. So those costs are mostly bared by those third parties. And here we come to one of the key concept that is often neglected by mainstream economists for many reasons. We will see three of them, which is the difference between individual risk and systemic risk. So I will go a bit deeper into that as one of the main 3 points of this second section. But this is just to say, keep in mind that any risk can be splitted into an individual risk and a systemic, broader global risk, for instance. This will be much clearer in a minute. So the main point here also is that if you think about this example that I just made about the business polluting with chemicals in the nearby river, is that most of the cost of these economic transactions or business activities, they don't only fall into third parties, but most of these third parties are either delayed in time, so future generations, if you think about the main issues with climate change. So the impact, one of the main problems is that most of the impacts are not, let's say, on the actual actors polluting, or not especially on the economic transactions actors, or the actors performing polluting economic activities, but mostly into future generations. So delayed in time in this case. And secondly, shifted in space, because despite the examples I just made with the local river, which was evidently polluting nearby territory, if you think about the end of this river, or if you think about other kind of polluting activities, so greenhouse gas emissions is one of them. Most of those impacts are also shifted, not only delayed in time, but also shifted in space. So developing countries, for example, if you think about nowadays, it's daily news about floods or hurricanes or extreme climate events that are bid us for the let's say butterfly effect, or how they call it. Those effects and impacts actually have origins on economic transactions that are not, or activities that are not necessarily in loco. So this is another key concept. So most of the climate change impacts are shifted either in space, either in time, or both. And this is also why it's pretty hard to communicate them. And this is also why there are very, very hard psychological barriers preventing climate action because of this, let's say, farness or distance between the originating economic transaction and the final impact. Again, both in time and space. So this is interrelated with the previous concept of individual and systemic risk, and you can wonder how. But again, this will be clearer during the next few slides. Typical environmental economic solution: let's tax or let's put carbon emission tax, for instance, on to disincentivize, so standard economic incentives kind of mechanism to prevent those activities. So let's put a tax actually on that business that is polluting the river with its chemicals. Problem here is that most of these policies, I haven't put references here, but there's many research on environmental economic policy in these regards, and how those carbon emission tax, for instance, are not particularly effective. Let's not talk about the political incentives to put them, but at the net of the political issues, even the tax itself have some issues in positive effects. So let's say in relevance and in evaluation and in actual impact to disincentivize those businesses to produce those activities and to pollute. So this is both true for the supply side and the demand side as well. If you think about the carbon emission compensations for flying and flight tickets, that's an example. So I'm realizing this has been pretty intense slide, but let's go into the three main points I wanted to make here more in detail. So let's unpack, let's say, this slide into three main points. So first, again, I already anticipated, but bear in mind the difference between individual and systemic risk. I just put here a market research survey result of a market research company asking the perception and measuring the perception of the seriousness of climate change, so the urgency of climate change compared to COVID-19. But I regardless of these results, I put this slide here because I wanted to explain the concept of individual versus systemic risk exactly by using the example of COVID-19. So during the recent and actual and current pandemic, the main problem in communicating the importance to applying whichever measures and whichever behavioral measures as well, so wearing a mask, washing your hands, etc., is exactly the gap between the individual risk to actually be contagious, so to actually have and take the virus, and on the other side, the systemic risk represented by the consequences of those behavioral or those behaviors not being followed to the general broader health system. So in other words, the gap that there is between your behavior of not wearing a mask and the effects that this can have not only on you, so not only the individual risk of you taking COVID, but on others at the broader level. And especially when I say systemic, in this case, I mean the crisis and the collapse of the of the health system. So this is and the healthcare structures, of course. So this is the main point here. So this gap, if you transfer it to the climate change scenario, to the climate change context, is the main reason why it's very hard to communicate and to apply, to let people, to make people apply those measures. It's exactly these enormous gaps sometimes between individual and systemic risk. So, ceteris paribus, you can transfer this example to the climate change issue. So, for instance, your action to take the car or take a flight or whatever other activity that can eventually pollute in some way. The gap between this activity and the incommensurable effects on a systemic level. This is the main point here. The second point is more has more to do with the discipline itself. So, of course, environmental economics is an applied discipline, adopting the same main conceptual framework of neoclassical economics, with a few adjustments, but the main framework stays the same. And this will be also the difference with ecological economics and Doughnut, for example, Doughnut Economics. And the main point here is that if you think about any macroeconomics that you studied in mainstream departments, most of it hasn't been built on macroscopic laws, meaning that most of macroeconomics, and this is like macro 101, is built on micro foundations. So all the global behavior, to use the right term, all the systemic issue are tackled with individual behaviors with studying individual behaviors being aggregated into macro variables. To make a comparison, if you think about classical physics or thermodynamics, you can study the behavior of the temperature. You can study the behavior of the variables of certain indicators, physical indicators. So if you think about temperature, and especially if you think about gas in general, so temperature is one of the variables measuring the behavior of gas. You can study temperature without studying without knowing the position, the speed, and all the characteristics of the single parcels or molecules forming the gas itself. So you can do that because you have macroscopic laws, like the main 2 or 3 laws of classical thermodynamics, or even Newton physics. You can do that without knowing the single parcel. So to make a comparison with physics, this can happen in physics to some extent, and in thermodynamics, but no standard macro theory is built in this way, and most of it is actually an aggregate of microeconomics. So individual behavior analysis being aggregated to study macro behavior. Third, it has more to do with methods rather than the theory, and it's a problem with measuring economic value. So again, if you think about negative externalities and the ways in which climate change is tackled by environmental economists, they have to measure stuff, right? So they have to assess cost quantitatively, in order to advise climate policy, without going into the discussion of why this is the case now. There's many historical reasons for that as well, but this is how is it. So the issue here is that only stuff that has quantitative measures like costs of economic transactions or proxies for measuring the chemicals polluting the river has been and is to some extent considered. All the other kind of polluting activities impact, most of them very, very hard, if not impossible, to measure quantitatively, like for the reasons I said before, because they are far in time and far in space. Or the systemic risk, for instance, which is technically impossible to be measured by aggregating individual behaviors assessments. All these other variables are basically neglected by, in this case, environmental economists. And this is true for all applied economics coming from the main conceptual framework of neoclassical economics, but we're talking here about environmental economics, so I made the example of a negative externality exactly for this reason. Okay, so these two were the main concepts that I'm asking you to bring with you in studying Doughnut Economics. And if you ever have the chance to read the book, please do that, because it's a nice and informing read, which is exactly debunking. I just mentioned a couple of them, but Kate is actually debunking one by one the main 7 pillars of standard economics, turning them into what she calls new economics, which is underpinning basically the theory of Doughnut Economics. So the main point here is my main point here is the need to change framework. So I showed some of the fallacies of mainstream environmental economics. I showed you the importance of changing frameworks and the impact, especially of theoretical framework into practice, in this case, into climate policy. Now I'm coming to the final part, in which I briefly present Doughnut Economics and, let's say, link the dots and give you some ideas on linking the dots between the 3 parts. So, as she calls it, this change of framework happens from old economics, which basically is the main neoclassical framework, to new economics, which in the Kate Raworth lens is exactly Doughnut Economics. Old economics is, for instance, mainstream economic growth models. I haven't had the opportunity to go, and I haven't had the time to go through those and the implications of those standard models, some of which are still heavily used in economic policy. But the main point here is that those models informing the standard supply chain, etc. So again, how theory informs practice, are very outdated. So some of the main concepts, like if you think about the solo model, come from decades like the 50s and the 60s, if not before, into some extent. So this is just to give you an idea. And the main idea here is that some of the causes of climate change, again, are rooted in these practices, the practices that have been informed by those models. So basically the economic policy implications of those economic growth models. I cite here the limits to growth. You may be already familiar with that report, but this is one one of the ones that was kind of neglected by mainstream economic policy for many reasons, and until now, but was exactly, let's say, measuring the forecasting on the impact of climate change decades later. This is the reason why we are here, basically. So 2017 is the year in which the book Doughnut Economics was published, and I already talked about briefly the structure of the book, but I really recommend to have a look at it. The main idea here is to debunk the 7 pillars in which neoclassical economics, on which neoclassical economics has been built and developed, to propose a new, totally different system to study the economy, not only and merely for the sake of theory. In fact, Kate was even has been criticized and was even attacked, accused by many Oxbridge economists for not being, let's say, a proper economist, because she has a master in development studies. But aside those legitimacy struggles and legitimacy battles, she's really into applied economic policy, so applied economic theory and therefore economic policy. And you will see it in the next slide. The main idea is to change the standard framework, actually offering one whole framework, which is not just a bunch of ideas from environmental economic studies, in order to allow policymakers, business practitioners, etc., to have a different mindset in order to tackle whichever economic transaction or business activity or policy activity they have to. And this boundedness and this embeddedness is built into the Doughnut, which is basically composed of 2 circles, an outer circle and an inner circle, the former representing planetary boundaries and the second representing basic social foundation. Here it is. I'm sorry to arrive that late into the main slide, probably, but I'm sure it's pretty intuitive, and you have the opportunity to go deeper in each of the sections that most interest you. There's a website which I didn't link here, unfortunately, that is made for that. You can find it through the Doughnut Economics Actions Lab website as well. So basically, this is the Doughnut. So the inner circle represents the basic social foundation, the basic social needs, divided into 12 areas. There's energy, water, food, health, etc. And this is basically what has been chopped into. This is basically the economy being chopped into 12 different areas. And this is the contribution of Kate Raworth, because the main outer circle, the ecological ceiling, so the planetary boundaries, is basically taken by research from environmental scientists, Rockstrom and others, putting together the 9 slices in which you can measure or conceptually separate the different dimensions of environmental degradation in general. So there's land conversion, biodiversity loss, air pollution, greenhouse gases, or climate change, ocean acidification, and each of them tackling and let's say considering one part of environmental degradation. Of course, the idea here is to stay within the donut, so to stay within the safe and just space for humanity, what she calls, and to embed economic policy that is distributive and this looks at the inner circle, so allowing those slices, water, food, health, etc., the minimum social foundation for all in each country. And on the other side, regenerative. So to not only allow the economy to stay above the social foundation, but especially within the ecological ceiling or planetary boundaries. And this happens through regenerative policy, as she calls it. So I will only steal 5 minutes because I have 5 slides. If you guys forgive me for this, for being a bit late, but so this is the main point here. Again, there has been concrete applications from the Netherlands, the UK, and more, not only at the city level, but especially at the country level. More and more countries are applying and are using the donut as a framework to study and to embed certain economic policies within that framework. So to tackle specific challenges, in the case of Amsterdam, there has been a lot with food waste, for example, and to tackle specific challenges with that mindset, with that framework. So there's, if you see the pictures of policy debates or business applications, there's actually managers or city councillors or mayors, etc., debating the issue of the local municipality or whatever it is, with the donut printed in the table, on the table in which they discuss those policies. So it's really the role about, it's not a lot about the details, but it's really offering a framework, a macroscopic framework, which old standard economics didn't offer so far, for tackling specific challenges and to actually view the whole economy as a relationship between the inner and the outer circle. And this is the main final point I wanted to make here. So rather than negative externalities, which has a particular view on economic transactions spilling over with cost on being dumped on third parties and measuring those costs, etc., with all the fallacies and all the lacks that this approach has, ecological economics instead, and donut economics specifically, view these issues differently. So rather focus on spillover effects, not in the classical ways in which this term has been used in standard environmental economics and classical economics, but rather studying the allowing for positive spillover effects being emerged by tackling one specific slide. So the idea and the way in which the donut is designed allows policymakers, for instance, to tackle one specific challenge, let's say applying or implementing an economic policy in the sector of health. This will have more often than not positive spillover effects on not only other slices of the inner circle, but especially the outer circle, because when you do that and when you design those policies, you have in mind the ecological ceiling. You don't have to overshoot, and you have in mind the lack and the picture of your specific city and country in regards of the inner circle social foundation lacking, for example. So in principle, by tackling one issue you could think you can either reduce the overshoot of the ecological ceiling or prevent the shortfall of the social foundation. But actually, my point here is that those policies, most of the times, and there has been actual very recent research on that. There's another website for that, which I haven't linked yet, but maybe in the Q&A I can provide you, which actually shows you how by tackling one single slice, so one single economic policy on one area, food or energy, if you think about energy, for instance, or water, can actually have positive impacts on other slices. So the main mind shift here is exactly as Kate fosters, to think systemically rather than specifically and single by single issues like environmental economics, but rather viewing the donut rather allows to view the systemic risk and the long-term prospects, impacts of any economic transactions, business activity, or policy decisions. And the final, really very final point here, again, just said in other words, is that the Doughnut Economics and the donut itself being used in the way it has been used and in the way it's being used and many others, and we can be creative with that, is actually a macroscopic, systemic, new framework that allows for theories, mindsets especially, to be changed in order to approach whichever current big challenges we have. I will not go into the Kuhn cycle, most of you are familiar with that, but the concept of paradigm shifts and of paradigms being incommensurable, if you think about the Doughnut Economics as the new and the new classical economics as the old approach, really can be revolutionary in not only in theory terms, but especially in practical terms. And in other words, if you see a rabbit here and you force yourself to see a duck, once you switch, and this is another funny way to experience it and explain this concept of paradigm shift, you cannot actually come back to see the rabbit. So that's and the other way around. So that's a nice way to let's say, to put in perspective the paradigm shift that, for the reasons I just mentioned here, Doughnut Economics can entail. Those are the two, let's say, the two main resources I wanted to point here. The book by Kate and the book of Rethink Economics, where you find an introduction to ecological economics as well, and from where I advise you to go finding sources and resources even more. Thank you. Sorry for being slightly late, but we have plenty of time for questions, I guess.
Thank you so much for that captivating presentation. I have to say, I especially appreciated how you kind of came from the issue of economics teaching, which is originally what brought us together, at least in the German Network for Pluralism in Economics, and then how you kind of zoomed in on the issue of climate change and showed how to not only criticize the mainstream, but to also engage constructively with what's going on. I really found that an interesting perspective. So as we have said in the beginning, we will now move on to the Q&A section of the lecture. And I see that some of you have already posted your questions, which is great. Just as a reminder, please ask your questions in the Q&A feature that you can see at the bottom of your screen. And if you ask it anonymously, I will simply read your question to Leonardo. And if you ask with your name, I will give you the chance to unmute yourself to ask him directly. And also don't forget to vote for questions that you find especially interesting. So I think, let me just open the Q&A. So the first question is by Thompson, and I will give you the chance to unmute yourself now, so you can ask it directly in just a second right now. Can you speak, Thompson? All right, seems like that's not the case. Then I will just read the question to you. So you have talked about how economic growth is basically the pillar of our societies and the thing we're striving for. And Thompson says it's blocking us from making social and economic changes to protect our resources and save our own lives and those of our children and future generations. So how can a different narrative and a value process on the care sector spur our economy towards a more social purpose? And as you also talked about valuation, which non-monetary languages of valuation can pave the way for such a transformation?
Okay, shall I try to answer? So thank you for the question. Let's start from your first sub question. So how different narrative and value process on the care sector can spur an economy towards social purpose. So it's interesting that you're mentioning here the care sector. I try to give my view on that. For sure, there has been research, especially in feminist economics. If you think about care on broader terms, I don't know if you're mentioning here healthcare or just care. But for example, care is one of the variables, and this comes from feminist approach that is very that is neglected and non embedded into the standard economic transactions. So if you think about not only family care and care of housewives, and that's where feminist economics come from, but especially care and also care in any other form, and this is where feminist economics expand, is not embedded in the mainstream approach, mainly I would say for exactly this challenge of measuring it, because would be kind of like bounded by would be limiting measuring it only with the equivalent of let's say of work hours or wage. So, but this goes a lot into the feminist economics debate. Rather, what links this question to the second one, which is the different narrative on one hand and the non-monetary languages or valuation on the other hand, is exactly the problem with measuring that I mentioned. So as I see it, one of the main issues with mainstream economics is not especially and only the theoretical frameworks, but particularly the methods. I've been encountering much more pluralism in terms of methods, and as a result of the cycle I showed you at the beginning, also in terms of theory, in applied economic disciplines, that I could not even think about being as pluralist. So marketing, and management have been and are indeed in their applied nature much more pluralist in the sense we interpret it than the mother of their theories being economics. So in other words, not only you can find still what are called the heterodox approaches like institutional economics or other heterodox approaches applied in practice. And this happens in marketing and management. So think about the impact that this can have for business practitioners, for instance. But also you can find qualitative methods, for example, because those disciplines are also informed by sociology and anthropology, even though being mainly applied economic disciplines, they still have a lot, to a great degree, a lot of pluralism, both in theories and methods. So my opinion and my personal take on that is that one way to go, because of the link between theory and practice, is that if you're pluralist in methods and as a consequence in theories, you can go tackling those issues not only in a broader way, but you can see things that with quantitative methods only, for instance, you cannot actually consider because you cannot technically measure them. So that would be one of the answers, but let's leave space for debate.
Thank you so much. The next question kind of tackles the circumstance that you and me, and at least those sitting around me from the organizing team, are from and sitting in the global north and discussing this issue. So do you think that Doughnut Economics is equally applicable to the global south as it is to the global north? Or should we kind of distinguish?
Okay, good, very good question. Almost impossible to answer, but I will try to give my take on that as well. So to some extent, yes, meaning that, I mean, the trivial answer would be depending on what you focus upon. In theory, you could apply the Doughnut in the global south as well, especially if you focus on you will eventually focus especially on the social foundation part, and that's the contribution that Kate made to the research by Oxfam and etc. So of course you could argue, okay, our challenges goes more in the direction of tackling of staying within the planetary boundaries. So we in the global north are much more focused on that because we luckily reached on most of the basic social needs, and the opposite is true for most of the global south countries, with exceptions, but generally shortfalls on basic social needs are the main characteristics of most of the global south countries if you measure them this way. My general view on that would be that, yeah, in theory you could apply it everywhere. In practice, of course, and you've been seeing this during the last COP21, for instance, the debate between the West, the North, and the South are endless into the matter of who should bear the cost of climate change, not only in terms of past emissions, but especially in terms of future emissions. And this is an endless ethical debate and political debate that is currently very hard to give a final answer. But let's say that Of course, in the global south, not only there are other priorities, maybe more that may be even more evident to some extent, but especially the use of such a model would be probably limited to still figuring out how to tackle some basic social needs. Then there are, you know, discussions between US and US and China and India on, you know, who should bear the cost of those emissions, path dependency, post-colonization, etc. Those are like, I mean, super complex issues that I honestly don't think just the donut can solve.
Thank you for giving such a sincere answer to that question. The next one comes from Chaptumo Anthony. Are you able to speak? Because if yes, oh, someone has already allowed you to speak. This would be your turn.
Can you hear me? Yeah, so my question is based on, for example, if where I live in Kenya, one of the challenges we have is the aggressive accumulation of local debt. So one of the reflections we have is that can we find a mode of financing that reduces this obsession with like this, because it's closer to us, you can get it. So we talk about sovereign wealth funds as alternative ways of getting some money for in terms of, you know, financing green capital and all that. So I was asking, what would Leonardo think about that particular issue? If we can find another way of funding, let's say, sustainable growth, sustainable agriculture, would it be better than depending on the classical modes of financing of these particular issues? Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to answer to that one as well. I think a very specific question. I think there's a number of things. So first, you were talking about a sector that is not necessarily embedded into the donut. So the donut is very much about real economy. And as you said, local debt, public debt, and in general, the financial market is not necessarily evident on the donut itself, and has much more complex dynamics than the real economy. So when you ask different ways of financing, of course, as you said, you know, there's different theories informing different mindsets on how finance should work, both public and private finance, but those are not necessarily within the main message of the donut. So that's why the donut is, we can debate about different methods of doing finance, of financing, alternative ways of financing local public debt, but those are not the main issues you see emerging from the donut. What you also mentioned that is, I think, more relevant, again, for Doughnut Economics is the local issues that you in Kenya can have, and we can come back to the previous question again, compared to other countries. So what the donut can say and can add to whichever approach you have, or whichever policy you want to implement locally, is the framework itself and the embeddedness of every, in this case, financial policy you may implement within a degree of sustainability, let's say. Then Kate doesn't really like the terms sustainable growth and others, green growth, etc., for other reasons, mainly because the donut itself is not compatible with any kind of further growth. So the donut itself comes from the idea that to stay within that safe and just space, we cannot go farther in growth, if at all we should degrow, or at least implement circular and regenerative, as she calls it, policies. So even in finance, that would be the guideline. But that's I know that's a very broad answer because of, you know, the object matter is different.
All right. In your response, you just also touched upon quite some topics that are in the questions. However, I am conscious of the time and would therefore, I believe, move to the last question, which regards the role of the commons, which is, according to this participant, also mentioned in the book on Doughnut Economics several times. And this person would like to know, what does Kate explicitly mean when talking about the commons, and what should their role be within the Doughnut economy?
Okay, so again, every as you know, every chapters every chapter of Kate has a very specific focus. She does talk about the commons, and here again, I think there's a endless debate we can start off about what is public and what is private, to put it to the very broad level. But I think within the framework of the donut, the main point of the commons in general is to reframe the way in which they are considered in standard economics. So again, if you think about the commons in common goods in standard neoclassical frameworks, in public economics more specifically, they are considered in a specific way by contrast with private goods, of course, on the one hand, and on the other hand, I would say in welfare economics in general, most of the approach to the common goods is very much informed by the neoclassical economics tendency to measure, for instance, as we said, you could argue that you can see the same kind of characteristics in public economics coming from the neoclassical framework as much as you can see neoclassical framework in environmental economics, as we showed today. So if you take those, we don't have time to go into every detail of how the commons are tackled by neoclassical economics. But if you take those and that approach, and you compare, let's say, if you do the same operation that Kate and me today, I try to do with ecological economics. So if you take the same kind of transition, you could envision and you could understand how the way in which you see the commons in neoclassical economics not only have its peculiar characteristics, but can be changed, and this change, the impact of this change into practice, can be enormous. And the main points in which you see Kate citing the commons, I mean, the underlying idea there, which is the underlying idea of the whole book, is that by changing that framework, so by changing the way in which you consider, in this case, the commons, you can have practical impacts on common goods matters and public economics, etc. So again, from theory to practice. Then the details in which this can happen, again, are like probably endless, because they are linked with some debates, not only from public economics, but from what is a common good and ethical considerations. But I would say, generally, broadly speaking, Kate or the Doughnut itself definitely would give a more holistic approach, and to the specific matter of the commons, she would consider them as more practically as one of the means through which you can deliver those 9 basic social needs that you see in the inner circle. Again, super broad answer this time, but I would say this is the main difference, and this is the main role that commons can have in the Doughnut.
I see that my colleague Kaustav has raised his hand. Do you also have a question?
Thank you, Sonia. With your permission and Leonardo's, can I just add one query from my side, if I may? Okay, thanks. So just to add that in the global south, in case of any development activities or infrastructural activities where environmental degradation or mining or deforestation is involved, then mostly the argument is given that whoever those who are protesting against those activities, they are being termed as anti-development, and then perhaps mostly it is involved with the civil society organizations and activities, those will be protesting and all. And then what in the Doughnut Economics, is there any role of government and then these civil societies activity, where who should be given priority and how to tackle, how to mobilize people in this arena? Is there anything that Kate is talking about? Thanks. And there's a fascinating discussion going on, so I just couldn't help it. Thanks.
Thank you, Kaustav. So again, to come back to the Global South issue, I think there's endless way in which you could apply the Doughnut. The main point that Kate wanted to make with this is not only to change the way to approach certain specific issues, but to make so the Doughnut is pretty horizontal, right? So again, in theory, you could actually think about the Global South or very much developing countries applying it into their local policy, and the way in which this can happen is there's numerous ways in which this can happen. One is to mobilize and activists, and climate policy, climate action is one of those ways in the West, at least. But the main revolution, to call it this way, is really through the embeddedness of this framework to whichever political decision in economic policy at the local first, and then at the broader country level. I can see that I can easily see that to embed and to convince policymakers in the Global South of the usefulness of this approach can be particularly difficult. But again, the focus would just shift into the basic social needs. If at all, even if this is not the main purpose, but if at all, at least, and there's the website that I mentioned by some researchers from the University of Leeds prove this. If at all, it can be, the donut can represent a tool to see all together those measures, even with all the limits that quantitatively measuring those slices have. If at all, this can be useful to have a picture of where each country is at its process towards the safe and just space of humanity. So there's, in this website, for instance, you could see each slice being measured by certain indicators, again, underlying all the limits that this can have. But at the very minimum, you can have a picture of each country path towards the donut. And again, you can see the enormous difference that you have between global South and global North countries in this regard. Again, you could think about endless way in which you can mobilize actors, economic actors, in using and applying the donut. Some of them are not even explored yet, and hopefully the exercise of practicing it will make emerging them.
All right. Thank you so much for that final response. Seeing that it's already past 8:30, I think I will have to close the Q&A now, which leads us to the end of the lecture. I guess for all remaining questions, we will just have to read the book. So thank you to everyone who contributed to the discussion with their questions, and of course to you, Leonardo, for your insightful presentation and your answers. I can at least speak for myself and for the organizing team of the Summer Academy, but for sure also for the participants when I say that we're really grateful for your dedication to this important discussion. So to our participants in the Summer Academy, I hope you enjoy your workshops tomorrow. And to everyone else, thank you so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening, or sleep well, depending on where you are right now. And for even sweeter dreams, don't forget to take a look at the other events that will frame the Summer Academy's program on our website. All right, that's it from me. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you so much.
Thank you.